Chapter 13. When Letty arrived, the real Letty, this time, she was carrying a bucket of water. It must have been heavy, judging from the way she carried it. She stepped over where the edge of the ring in the grass must have been, and she came straight to me.
"Sorry,"
she said.
"That took a lot longer than I expected. It didn't want to cooperate neither, and in the end, it took me and Gran to do it. And she did most of the heavy lifting. I wasn't going to argue with her, but it didn't help, and it's not easy."
"What?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" She put the metal bucket down on the grass beside me without spilling a drop.
"The ocean,"
she said.
"It didn't want to go. It gave Gran such a struggle that she said she was going to have to go and have a lie down afterwards. But we still got it into the bucket in the end."
The water in the bucket was glowing, emitting a greenish-blue light. I could see Letty's face by it. I could see the waves and ripples on the surface of the water, watch them crest and splash against the side of the bucket. "I don't understand."
"I couldn't get you to the ocean,"
she said.
"But there was nothing stopping me bringing the ocean to you."
I said, "I'm hungry, Letty, and I don't like this."
"Mum's made dinner, but you're going to have to stay hungry for a little bit longer. Were you scared up here on your own?"
"Yes."
"Did they try and get you out of the circle?"
"Yes." She took my hands in hers then and squeezed them.
"But you stayed where you were meant to be, and you didn't listen to them. Well done. That's quality, that is."
And she sounded proud. In that moment, I forgot my hunger and I forgot my fear. "What do I do now?" I asked her.
"Now," she said, "you step into the bucket. You don't have to take your shoes off or anything. Just step in."
It did not even seem a strange request. She let go of one of my hands and kept hold of the other. I thought, I will never let go of your hand, not unless you tell me to. I put one foot into the glimmering water, raising the water level almost to the edge. My foot rested on the tin floor of the bucket. The water was cool on my foot, not cold. I put the other foot into the water, and I went down with it, like a marble statue, and the waves of Letty Hempstock's ocean closed over my head. I felt the same shock you would feel if you had stepped backwards without looking and had fallen into a swimming pool. I closed my eyes at the water's sting and kept them tightly shut. So tightly. I could not swim. I did not know where I was or what was happening, but even under the water I could feel that Letty was still holding my hand. I was holding my breath. I held it until I could hold it no longer, and then I gulped a breath in, expecting to choke, to sputter, to die. I did not choke. I felt the coldness of the water, if it was water, pour into my nose and my throat, felt it fill my lungs. But that was all it did. It did not hurt me. I thought, this is the kind of water you can breathe. I thought, perhaps, there is just a secret to breathing water. Something simple that everyone could do, if they only knew. That was what I thought. That was the first thing I thought. The second thing I thought was that I knew everything. Letty Hempstock's ocean flowed inside me, and it filled the entire universe, from egg to rose. I knew that. I knew what egg was, where the universe began, to the sound of uncreated voices singing in the void. And I knew where rose was, the peculiar crinkling of space on space into dimensions that fold like origami and blossom like strange orchids, and which would mark the last good time before the eventual end of everything and the next big bang, which would be, I knew now, nothing of the kind. I knew that old Mrs. Hempstock would be here for that one, as she had been for the last. I saw the world I had walked since my birth, and I understood how fragile it was, that the reality I knew was a thin layer of icing on a great dark birthday cake, writhing with grubs and nightmares and hunger. I saw the world from above and below. I saw that there were patterns and gates and paths beyond the real. I saw all these things and understood them, and they filled me, just as the waters of the ocean filled me. Everything whispered inside me. Everything spoke to everything, and I knew it all. I opened my eyes, curious to learn what I would see in the world outside me, if it would be anything like the world inside. I was hanging deep beneath the water. I looked down, and the blue world below me receded into darkness. I looked up, and the world above me did the same. Nothing was pulling me down deeper. Nothing was forcing me towards the surface. And then I turned my head a little to look at her, because she was still holding my hand. She had never let go of my hand, and I saw Letty Hempstock. At first I do not think I knew what I was looking at. I could make no sense of it. Where Ursula Monckton had been made of gray cloth that flapped and snapped and gusted in the storm winds, Letty Hempstock was made of silken sheets, the color of ice, filled with tiny flickering candle flames, 100 candle flames. Could there be candle flames burning under the water? There could. I knew that when I was in the ocean, and I even knew how. I understood it just as I understood dark matter, the material of the universe that makes up everything that must be there, but we cannot find. I found myself thinking of an ocean running beneath the whole universe, like the dark seawater that laps beneath the wooden boards of an old pier, an ocean that stretches from forever to forever, and is still small enough to fit inside a bucket, if you have old Mrs. Hempstock to help you when you asked nicely. Letty Hempstock looked like pale silk and candle flames. I wondered how I looked to her in that place. And I knew that even in a place that was nothing but knowledge, that was the one thing I could not know. That if I looked inward, I would see only infinite mirrors, staring into myself for eternity. The silk filled with candle flames moved then, a slow, graceful, under-the-water sort of movement. The current pulled at it, and now it had arms, and the hand that had never let go of mine, and a body, and a freckled face that was familiar. And it opened its mouth, and in Letty Hempstock's voice, it said,
I'm really sorry.
"What for?" She did not reply. The currents of the ocean pulled at my hair and my clothes like summer breezes. I was no longer cold, and I knew everything, and I was not hungry, and the whole big, complicated world was simple and graspable and easy to unlock. I would stay here for the rest of time in the ocean, which was the universe, which was the soul, which was all that mattered. I would stay here forever.
You can't,
said Letty.
It would destroy you.
I opened my mouth to tell her that nothing could kill me, not now. But she said,
Not kill you, destroy you, dissolve you. You wouldn't die in here. Nothing ever dies in here. But if you stayed here for too long, just a little of you would exist everywhere, all spread out. And that's not a good thing. Never enough of you all together in one place, so there wouldn't be anything left that would think of itself as an I. No point of view any longer, because you'd be an infinite sequence of views and of points. I was going to argue with her. She was wrong. She had to be. I loved that place, that state, that feeling, and I was never going to leave it. And then my head broke water, and I blinked and coughed, and I was standing thigh-deep in the pond at the back of the Hempstock's farm, and Letty Hempstock was standing beside me, holding my hand.
I coughed again, and it felt like water fled my nose, my throat, my lungs. I pulled clean air into my chest in the light of the huge full harvest moon that shone on the hempstalk's red-tiled roof. And for one final perfect moment, I still knew everything. I remember that I knew how to make it so the moon would be full when you needed it to be, and shining just on the back of the house every night. I knew everything, but Letty Hempstalk was pulling me up out of the pond. I was still wearing the strange old-fashioned clothes I had been given that morning, and as I stepped out of the pond, up onto the grass that edged it, I discovered that my clothes and my skin were now perfectly dry. The ocean was back in the pond, and all the knowledge I was left with, as if I had woken from a dream on a summer's day, was that it had not been long ago since I had known everything. I looked at Letty in the moonlight. "Is that how it is for you?" I asked.
Is what how it is for me?
"Do you still know everything? All the time?" She shook her head. She didn't smile. She said,
Be boring, knowing everything. You have to give all that stuff up if you're going to muck about here.
"So you used to know everything?" She wrinkled her nose.
Everybody did. I told you, it's nothing special, knowing how things work. And you really do have to give it all up if you want to play.
"To play what?"
This.
She said. She waved at the house and the sky, and the impossible full moon, and the skeins and shawls and clusters of bright stars. I wish I knew what she meant. It was as if she was talking about a dream we had shared. For a moment it was so close in my mind that I could almost touch it.
You must be so hungry,
said Letty, and the moment was broken. And yes, I was so hungry, and the hunger took my head and swallowed my lingering dreams. There was a plate in my place at the table in the farmhouse's huge kitchen. On it was a portion of shepherd's pie, the mashed potato a crusty brown on top, minced meat and vegetables and gravy beneath it. I was scared of eating food outside my home, scared that I might want to leave food I did not like and be told off, or be forced to sit and eat it in minuscule portions until it was gone, as I was at school. But the food at the Hempstocks was always perfect. It did not scare me. Ginny Hempstock was there, bustling about in her apron, rounded and welcoming. I ate without talking, head down, shoveling the welcome food into my mouth. The woman and the girl spoke in low, urgent tones.
They'll be here soon enough,
said Letty.
They aren't stupid, and they won't leave until they've taken the last little bit of what they came here for.
Her mother sniffed. Her red cheeks were flushed from the heat of the kitchen fire. Stuff and nonsense, she said. They're all mouth, they are. I had never heard that expression before, and I thought she was telling us that the creatures were just mouths and nothing more. It didn't seem unlikely that the shadows were indeed all mouths. I had seen them devour the gray thing that had called itself Ursula Monkton. My mother's mother would tell me off for eating like a wild animal.
You must essen eat, she would say. Like a person, not a chaser, a pig. When animals eat, they fress. People essen. Eat like a person.
Fressen. That was how the hunger birds had taken Ursula Monkton. And it was also, I had no doubt, how they would consume me.
I've never seen so many of them, said Letty. When they came here in the old days, there was only a handful of them.
Ginny poured me a glass of water. That's your own fault, she told Letty. You put up signals and called them, like banging the dinner bell you were. Not surprising they all came.
I just wanted to make sure that she left, said Letty.
Her kind. They're like chickens who get out of the hen house and are so proud of themselves and so puffed up for being able to eat all the worms and beetles and caterpillars they want that they never think about the foxes, said Ginny. Anyway, now we've got foxes, and we'll send them all home same as we did the last times they were sniffing around. We did it before, didn't we?
Not really,
said Letty.
Either we sent the flea home, and the varmints had nothing to hang around for, like the flea in the cellar at Cromwell's time, or they came and took what they came here for, and then they went away. Like the fat flea who made people's dreams come true in Red Rufus's day. They took him and they upped and left. You never had to get rid of them before.
Her mother shrugged. It's all the same sort of thing. We'll just send them back where they came from.
And where do they come from?
Asked Letty. I had slowed down now and was making the final fragments of my shepherd's pie last as long as I could, prodding them around the plate slowly with my fork. That don't matter, said Jenny. They all go back eventually. Probably just get bored of waiting.
I tried pushing them, said Letty Hempstock matter-of-factly. Couldn't get any traction. I held them with a dome of protection, but that wouldn't have lasted much longer. We're good here. Nothing's coming into this farm without our say-so.
In or out, said Jenny. She removed my empty plate, replaced it with a bowl containing a steaming slice of spotted dick with thick yellow custard drizzled all over it. I ate it with joy. I do not miss childhood, but I miss the way I took pleasure in small things, even as greater things crumbled. I could not control the world I was in, could not walk away from things or people or moments that hurt, but I took joy in the things that made me happy. The custard was sweet and creamy in my mouth. The dark, swollen currants in the spotted dick were tangy in the cake, thick, chewy blandness of the pudding. And perhaps I was going to die that night, and perhaps I would never go home again. But it was a good dinner, and I had faith in Letty Hempstock. The world outside the kitchen was still waiting. The Hempstocks' fog-colored house cat, I do not believe I ever knew her name, padded through the kitchen. That reminded me. Mrs. Hempstock? Is the kitten still here? The black one with the white ear? Not tonight, said Jenny Hempstock. She's out and about, was asleep on the chair in the hall all this afternoon. I wish I could stroke her soft fur. I realized, to say goodbye. I suppose, if I do, have to die, tonight. I started, haltingly, not sure where I was going. I was going to ask for something, I imagine, for them to say goodbye to my mummy and daddy, or to tell my sister that it wasn't fair that nothing bad ever happened to her, that her life was charmed and safe and protected, while I was forever stumbling into disaster. But nothing seemed right, and I was relieved when Ginny interrupted me. Nobody is going to die tonight, she said firmly. She took my empty bowl and washed it out in the sink. Then she dried her hands on her apron. She took the apron off and went out into the hallway and returned a few moments later, wearing a plain brown coat and a pair of large dark green Wellington boots. Letty seemed less confident than Ginny, but Letty, with all her age and wisdom, was a girl, while Ginny was an adult, and her confidence reassured me. I had faith in both of them. Where's old Mrs. Hempstock? I asked. Having a lie down, said Ginny. She is not as young as she used to be. How old is she? I asked, not expecting to get an answer. Ginny just smiled, and Letty shrugged. I held Letty's hand as we left the farmhouse, promising myself that this time I would not let it go. Chapter 14. When I entered the farmhouse through the back door, the moon had been full, and it was a perfect summer's night. When I left, I went with Letty Hempstock and her mother out of the front door, and the moon was a curved white smile, high in a cloudy sky, and the night was gusty with sudden, undecided spring breezes, coming first from one direction, then the other. Every now and then, a gust of wind would contain a sprinkling of rain that never amounted to anything more than that. We walked through the manure-stinking farmland and up the lane. We passed a bend in the road. Although it was dark, I knew exactly where we were. This was where it had all begun. It was the corner where the opal miner had parked my family's white Mini. The place he had died all alone, with a face the color of pomegranate juice, aching for his lost money, on the edge of the hemp-stock land, where the barriers between life and death were thin. I said, "I think we should wake up old Mrs. Hempstock."
"It doesn't work like that," said Letty. "When she's tired, she sleeps until she wakes up on her own. A few minutes or 100 years. There's no waking her. Might as well try waking up an atom bomb."
Ginny Hempstock stopped, and she planted herself in the middle of the lane, facing away from the farmhouse. "Right!" she shouted to the night. "Let's be having you." Nothing. A wet wind that gusted and was gone. Letty said,
"Perhaps they've all gone home."
"Be nice if they had," said Ginny. "All this palaver and nonsense." I felt guilty. It was, I knew, my fault. If I had kept hold of Letty's hand, none of this would have happened. Ursula Monckton, the Hunger Birds, these things were undoubtedly my responsibility. Even if what had happened, or now that had perhaps no longer happened, in the cold bath that previous night, I had a thought. Can't you just snip it out? The thing in my heart that they want? Maybe you could snip it out like your granny snipped things last night. Letty squeezed my hand in the dark.
"Maybe Gran could do that if she was here," she said. "I can't. I don't think Mum could either. It's really hard, snipping things out of time. You have to make sure that the edges all line up, and even Gran doesn't always get it right. And this would be harder than that. It's a real thing. I don't think even Gran could take it out of you without hurting your heart, and you need your heart."
Then she said,
"They're coming."
but I knew something was happening. Knew it before she said anything. For the second time, I saw the ground begin to glow golden. I watched the trees and the grass, the hedgerows and the willow clumps, and the last stray daffodils begin to shine with the burnished half-light. I looked around, half fearful, half with wonder, and I observed that the light was brightest behind the house and over to the west where the pond was. I heard the beating of mighty wings and a series of low thumps. I turned, and I saw them, the vultures of the void, the carrion kind, the hunger birds. They were not shadows any longer, not here, not in this place. They were all too real, and they landed in the darkness just beyond the golden glow of the ground. They landed in the air and in the trees, and they shuffled forward as close as they could get to the golden ground of the Hempstock's farm. They were huge. Each of them was bigger than I was. I would have been hard-pressed to describe their faces, though. I could see them, look at them, take in every feature, but the moment I looked away, they were gone, and there was nothing in my mind where the hunger birds had been but tearing rakes and talons, or wriggling tentacles, or hairy, chitinous mandibles. I could not keep their true faces in my head. When I turned away, the only knowledge I retained was that they had been looking directly at me, and that they were ravenous. "Right, my proud beauties," said Ginny Hempstock loudly. Her hands were on her hips of her brown coat. "You can't stay here, you know that. Time to get a move on." And then she said simply, "Hop it." They shifted, but they did not move, the innumerable hunger birds, and they began to make a noise. I thought that they were whispering amongst themselves, and then it seemed to me that the noise they were making was an amused chuckling. I heard their voices, distinct but twining together, so I could not tell which creature was speaking. "We are the hunger birds. We have devoured palaces and worlds and kings and stars. We can stay wherever we wish to stay. We perform our function. We are necessary." and they laughed so loudly it seemed like a train approaching. I squeezed Letty's hand, and she squeezed mine. "Give us the boy," Ginny said. "You're wasting your time, and you're wasting mine. Go home." "We were summoned here. We do not need to leave until we have done what we came here for. We restore things to the way they are meant to be. Would you deprive us of our function?" "Of course I will," said Ginny. "You've had your dinner. Now you're just making nuisances of yourselves. Be off with you, blinking varmints. I wouldn't give 2 pence halfpenny for the lot of you. Go home." And she shook her hand in a flicking gesture. One of the creatures let out a long, wailing scream of appetite and frustration. Letty's hold on my hand was firm. She said,
"He's under our protection. He's on our land. And one step onto our land and that's the end of you. So go away."
The creatures seemed to huddle closer. There was silence in the Sussex night, only the rustle of leaves in the wind, only the call of a distant owl, only the sigh of the breeze as it passed. But in that silence I could hear the hungerbirds conferring, weighing up their options, plotting their course, and in that silence I felt their eyes upon me. Something in a tree flapped its huge wings and cried out, a shriek that mingled triumph and delight, an affirmative shout of hunger and joy. I felt something in my chest react to the scream, like the tiniest splinter of ice inside my heart. "We cannot cross the border, this is true. We cannot take the child from your land, this is also true. We cannot hurt your farm or your creatures."
"That's right. You can't. So get along with you. Go home. Haven't you got a war to be getting back to?"
"We cannot hurt your world, true. But we can hurt this one." One of the hungerbirds reached a sharp beak down to the ground at its feet and began to tear at it, not as a creature that eats earth and grass, but as if it were eating a curtain or a piece of scenery from the world painted on it. Where it devoured the grass, nothing remained. A perfect nothing. Only a color that reminded me of gray, but a formless, pulsing gray, like the shifting static of our television screen, when you dislodged the aerial cord and the picture had gone completely. This was the void. Not blackness, not nothingness. This was what lay beneath the thinly painted scrim of reality. And the hungerbirds began to flap and to flock. They landed on a huge oak tree, and they tore at it, and they wolfed it down, and in moments the tree was gone, along with everything that had been behind it. A fox slipped out of a hedgerow and slunk down the lane, its eyes and mask and brush illuminated golden by the farmlight. Before it had made it halfway across the road, it had been ripped from the world, and there was only void behind it. Letty said,
"What he said before. We have to wake Gran."
"She won't like that," said Ginny. "Might as well try and wake up."
"Don't matter. If we can't wake her up, they'll destroy the whole of this creation."
Ginny said only, "I don't know how." A clump of hungerbirds flew up to a patch of the night sky where the stars could be seen through the breaks in the clouds, and they tore at a kite-shaped constellation I could never have named. And they scratched, and they rent, and they gulped, and they swallowed. In a handful of heartbeats where the constellation and sky had been, there was now only a pulsing nothingness that hurt my eyes if I looked at it directly. I was a normal child, which is to say I was selfish, and I was not entirely convinced of the existence of things that were not me. And I was certain, rock solid, unshakably certain, that I was the most important thing in creation. There was nothing that was more important to me than I was. Even so, I understood what I was seeing. The hungerbirds would, no, they were ripping the world away, tearing it into nothing. Soon enough there would be no world. My mother, my father, my sister, my house, my school friends, my town, my grandparents, London, the Natural History Museum, France, television, books, ancient Egypt. Because of me. All these things would be gone, and there would be nothing in their place. I did not want to die. More than that, I did not want to die as Ursula Monckton had died, beneath the rending talons and beaks of things that might not even have had legs or faces. I did not want to die at all. understand that. I let go of Letty Hempstock's hand and I ran, as fast as I could, knowing that to hesitate, even to slow down, would be to change my mind, which would be the wrong thing, which would be to save my life. How far did I run? Not far, I suppose, as these things go. Letty Hempstock was shouting at me to stop, but still I ran, crossing the farmland where every blade of grass, every pebble on the lane, every willow tree and hazel hedge glowed golden, and I ran towards the darkness. I ran, and I hated myself for running, as I had hated myself the time I had jumped from the high board at the swimming pool, knowing there was no going back, that there was no way this could end in anything but pain. They took off into the air, the hunger birds, as I ran towards them, as pigeons will rise when you run at them. I knew they were circling. I stood there in the darkness and I waited for them to descend. I waited for their beaks to tear at my chest, for them to devour my heart. I stood there for perhaps 2 heartbeats, and it felt like forever. It happened. Something slammed into me from behind and knocked me down into the mud on the side of the lane, face first. I saw bursts of light that were not there. The ground hit my stomach, and the wind was knocked out of me. A ghost memory rises here, a phantom moment, a shaky reflection in the pool of remembrance. I know how it would have felt when they took my heart, how it felt as the hunger birds, all mouth, tore into my chest and snatched out my heart, still pumping, and devoured it to get at what was hidden inside it. I know how that feels, as if it was truly a part of my life, of my death. And then the memory snips and rips neatly, and a voice said, "Idiot, don't move, just don't." And the voice was Letty Hempstock's, and I could not have moved if I had wanted to. She was on top of me, and she was heavier than I was, and she was pushing me down into the grass and the wet earth. I could see nothing. I felt them, though. I felt them crash into her. She was holding me down, making herself a barrier between me and the world. I heard Letty's voice wail in pain. I felt her shudder and twitch. A voice said, "This is unacceptable." It was a familiar voice, but still I could not place it or move to see who was talking. Letty was on top of me, still shaking, but as the voice spoke, she stopped moving. The voice continued, "On what authority do you harm my child?" A pause. Then, she was between us and our lawful prey. "You're scavengers, eaters of all full of rubbish, of garbage. You're cleaners. Do you think that you can harm my family?" I knew who was talking. The voice sounded like Letty's gran, like old Mrs. Hempstock. Like her, I knew, and yet so unlike. If old Mrs. Hempstock had been an empress, she might have talked like that. Her voice more stilted and formal, and yet more musical than the old lady voice I knew. Something wet and warm was soaking my back. No, lady. That was the first time I heard fear or doubt in the voice of one of the hunger birds. "There are pacts, and there are laws, and there are treaties, and you have violated all of them." Silence then, and it was louder than words could have been. They had nothing to say. I felt Letty's body being rolled off mine, and I looked up to see Jenny Hempstock's sensible face. She sat on the ground on the edge of the road, and I buried my face in her bosom. She took me in one arm, Letty in the other. From the shadows, a hunger bird spoke with a voice that was not a voice, and it said only, "We are sorry for your loss." Sorry! The word was spat, not said. Jenny Hempstock swayed from side to side, crooning low and wordlessly to me and to her daughter. Her arms were around me. I lifted my head and I looked back at the person speaking. My vision blurred my tears. I stared at her. It was old Mrs. Hempstock, I suppose, but it wasn't. It was Letty's gran in the same way that... she shone silver. Her hair was still long, still white, but now she stood as straight as a teenager. My eyes had become used to the darkness. and I could not look at her face to see if it was the face I was familiar with. It was too bright. Magnesium flare bright. Fireworks night bright. Midday sun reflecting off a silver coin bright. I looked at her as long as I could bear to look, and then I turned my head, screwing my eyes tightly shut, unable to see anything but a pulsating after-image. The voice that was like old Mrs. Hemstock said,
"Shall I bind you to the heart of a dark star, to feel your pain in a place where every fragment of a moment lasts 1,000 years? Shall I invoke the compacts of creation, and have you all removed from the list of created things, so there never will have been any hungerbirds, and anything that wishes to traipse from world to world can do so with impunity?"
I listened for a reply, but heard nothing. Only a whimper, a mewl of pain or of frustration.
"I'm done with you. I will deal with you in my own time and in my own way, for now I must tend to the children."
"Yes, lady. Thank you, lady."
"Not so fast. Nobody's going anywhere before you put all these things back like they was. There's boots missing from the sky, there's an oak tree gone and a fox. You put them all back, the way they were."
And then the silvery empress added in a voice that was now also unmistakably old Mrs. Hemstock's,
"Varmints!"
Somebody was humming a tune. I realized, as if from a long way away, that it was me, at the same moment that I remembered what the tune was. "Girls and boys, come out to play. The moon doth shine as bright as day. Leave your supper and leave your meat, and join your playfellows in the street. Come with a whoop and come with a call. Come with a whole heart, or none at all." I held on to Ginny Hemstock. She smelled like a farm and like a kitchen, like animals and like food. She smelled very real, and the realness was what I needed at that moment. I reached out a hand, tentatively touched Letty's shoulder. She did not move or respond. Jenny started speaking then, but at first I did not know if she was talking to herself or to Letty or to me. "They overstepped their bounds," she said. "They could have hurt you, child, and it would have meant nothing. They could have hurt this world without anything being said. It's only a world after all, and they're just sand grains in the desert worlds. But Letty's a Hemstock. She's outside of their domain, my little one. And they hurted her." I looked at Letty. Her head had flopped down, hiding her face. Her eyes were closed. "Is she going to be all right?" I asked. Ginny didn't reply, just hugged us both the tighter to her bosom and rocked and crooned a wordless song. The farm and its land no longer glowed golden. I could not feel anything in the shadows watching me, not any longer.
"Don't worry,"
said an old voice, now familiar once more.
"You're safe as houses. Safer than most houses I've seen. They've gone."
"They'll come back again," I said. "They want my heart."
"They'd not come back to this world again for all the tea in China,"
said old Mrs. Hemstock.
"Not that they've got any use for tea, or for China. No more than a carrion crow does."
Why had I thought her dressed in silver? She wore a much patched gray dressing gown over what had been a night tea, but a night tea of a kind that had not been fashionable for several 100 years. The old woman put a hand on her granddaughter's pale forehead, lifted it up, then let it go. Letty's mother shook her head. "It's over," she said. I understood it then at the last, and felt foolish for not understanding it sooner. The girl beside me, on her mother's lap, at her mother's breast, had given her life for mine. "They were meant to hurt me, not her," I said.
"No reason they shouldn't have taken either of you,"
said the old lady with a sniff. I felt guilt then. Guilt beyond anything I had ever felt before. "We should get her to a hospital," I said hopefully. "We can call a doctor. Maybe they can make her better." Ginny shook her head. "Is she dead?" I asked.
"Dead,"
repeated the old woman in the dressing gown. She sounded offended.
As if, she said, grandly, aspirating each esh, as if that were the only way to convey the gravity of her words. As if an Emstock have ever do anything so common.
She's hurt, said Jenny Hempstock, cuddling me close. Hurt as badly as she can be hurt. She's so close to death as to make no odds if we don't do something about it, and quickly. A final hug. Then, off with you now. I clambered reluctantly from her lap and stood up. Jenny Hempstock rose to her feet, her daughter's body limp in her arms. Letty lulled and was jogged like a rag doll as her mother got up, and I stared at her, shocked beyond measure. I said, "It's my fault. I'm sorry. I'm really sorry." Old Mrs. Hempstock said,
"You meant well."
But Jenny Hempstock said nothing at all. She walked down the lane towards the farm, and then she turned off behind the milking shed. I thought that Letty was too big to be carried, but Jenny carried her as if she weighed no more than a kitten, her head and upper body resting on Jenny's shoulder, like a sleeping infant being taken upstairs to bed. Jenny carried her down that path and beside the hedge and back until we reached the pond. There were no breezes back there, and the night was perfectly still. Our path was lit by moonlight, and nothing more. The pond, when we got there, was just a pond. No golden glimmering light, no magical full moon. It was black and dull, with the moon, the true moon, the quarter moon, reflecting in it. I stopped at the edge of the pond, and old Mrs. Hempstock stopped beside me. But Jenny Hempstock kept walking. She staggered down into the pond until she was wading thigh-deep, her coat and skirt floating on the water as she waded, breaking the reflected moon into dozens of tiny moons that scattered and reformed around her. At the center of the pond, with the black water above her hips, she stopped. She took Letty from her shoulder so the girl's body was supported at the head and at the knees by Jenny Hempstock's practical hands. Then slowly, so very slowly, she laid Letty down in the water. The girl's body floated on the surface of the pond. Jenny took a step back, and then another, never looking away from her daughter. I heard a rushing noise, as if of an enormous wind coming towards us. Letty's body shook. There was no breeze, but now there were white caps on the surface of the pond. I saw waves, gentle, lapping waves at first, and then bigger waves that broke and slapped at the edge of the pond. One wave crested and crashed down close to me, splashing my clothes and face. I could taste the water's wetness on my lips, and it was salt. I whispered, "I'm sorry, Letty." I should have been able to see the other side of the pond. I had seen it a few moments before, but the crashing waves had taken it away, and I could see nothing beyond Letty's floating body but the vastness of the lonely ocean and the dark. The waves grew bigger. The water began to glow in the moonlight, as it had glowed when it was in the bucket, a pale, perfect blue. The black shape on the surface of the water was the body of the girl who had saved my life. Bony fingers rested on my shoulder.
"What are you apologizing for, boy? For killing her?"
I nodded, not trusting myself to speak.
"She's not dead. You didn't kill her, nor did the Hungerbirds, although they did their best to get to you through her. She's been given to her ocean. One day, in its own time, the ocean will give her back."
I thought of corpses and of skeletons with pearls for eyes. I thought of mermaids with tails that flicked when they moved, like my goldfish's tail had flicked before my goldfish had stopped moving, to lie, belly up, like Letty, on the top of the water. I said, "Will she be the same?" The old woman guffawed as if I had said the funniest thing in the universe.
"Nothing's ever the same," she said. Be it a second later or 100 years, it's always churning and roiling, and people change as much as oceans.
Ginny clambered out of the water, and she stood at the water's edge beside me, her head bowed. The waves crashed and smacked and splashed and retreated. There was a distant rumble that became a louder and louder rumble. Something was coming towards us, across the ocean. From miles away, from hundreds and hundreds of miles away, it came, a thin white line etched in the glowing blue. And it grew as it approached. The great wave came, and the world rumbled, and I looked up as it reached us. It was taller than trees, than houses, than mind or eyes could hold, than heart could follow. Only when it reached Letty Hempstock's floating body did the enormous wave crash down. I expected to be soaked, or worse, to be swept away by the angry ocean water, and I raised my arm to cover my face. There was no splash of breakers, no deafening crash, and when I lowered my arm I could see nothing but the still black water of the pond in the night, and nothing on the surface of the pond but a smattering of lily pads and the thoughtful, incomplete reflection of the moon. Old Mrs. Hempstock was gone too. I had thought that she was standing beside me, but only Ginny stood there, next to me, staring down silently into the dark mirror of the little pond. "Right," she said. "I'll take you home." Chapter 15. There was a Land Rover parked behind the cowshed. The doors were open and the ignition key was in the lock. I sat on the newspaper-covered passenger seat and watched Ginny Hempstock turn the key. The engine sputtered a few times before it started. I had not imagined any of the Hempstocks driving. I said, "I didn't know you had a car." "Lots of things you don't know," said Mrs. Hempstock tartly. Then she glanced at me more gently and said, "You can't know everything." She backed the Land Rover up, and it bumped its way along across the ruts and puddles of the back of the farmyard. There was something on my mind. "Old Mrs. Hempstock says that Letty isn't dead," I said. "But she looked dead. I think she is actually dead. I don't think it's true that she's not dead." Ginny looked like she was going to say something about the nature of truth, but all she said was, "She's hurt, very badly. The ocean has taken her. Honestly, I don't know if it will ever give her back, but we can hope, can't we?" "Yes." I squeezed my hands into fists, and I hoped as hard as I knew how. We bumped and jolted up the lane at 15 miles per hour. I said, is she really your daughter?" I didn't know. I still don't know why I asked her that. Perhaps I just wanted to know more about the girl who had saved my life, who had rescued me more than once. I didn't know anything about her. "More or less," said Ginny. "The men Hempstocks, my brothers, they went out into the world and they had babies who had babies. There are Hempstock women out there in your world, and I'll wager each of them is a wonder in her own way. But only Gran and me and Letty are the pure thing." "She didn't have a daddy?" I asked. "No." "Did you have a daddy?" "You're all questions, aren't you?" "No, love. We never went in for that sort of thing. You only need men if you want to breed more men." I said, "You don't have to take me home. I could stay with you. I could wait until Letty comes back from the ocean. I could work on your farm and carry stuff and learn to drive a tractor." She said, "No." But she said it kindly. "You get on with your own life. Letty gave it to you. You just have to grow up and try to be worth it." A flash of resentment. It's hard enough being alive, trying to survive in the world and find your place in it, to do the things you need to do to get by, without wondering if the thing you just did, whatever it was worth someone having, if not died, then given up her life. It wasn't fair. "Life's not fair," said Ginny, as if I had spoken aloud. She turned into our driveway, pulled up outside the front door. I got out and she did too. "Better make it easier for you to go home," she said. Mrs. Hempstock rang the doorbell. although the door was never locked, and industriously scraped the soles of her Wellington boots on the doormat until my mother opened the door. She was dressed for bed and wearing her quilted pink dressing gown. "Here he is," said Jenny. "Safe and sound, the soldier back from the wars. He had a lovely time at our Letty's going-away party, and now it's time for this young man to get his rest." My mother looked blank, almost confused, and then the confusion was replaced by a smile, as if the world had just reconfigured itself into a form that made sense. "Oh, you didn't have to bring him back," said my mother. "One of us would have come and picked him up." Then she looked down at me. "What do you say to Mrs. Hempstock, darling?" I said it automatically. "Thank you for having me." My mother said, "Very good, dear." Then, "Letty's going away?" "To Australia," said Jenny, "to be with her father. We'll miss having this little fellow over to play, but, well, we'll let you know when Letty comes back. He can come and play then." I was getting tired. The party had been fun, although I could not remember much of it. I knew that I would not visit the Hempstock farm again, though, not unless Letty was there. Australia was a long, long way away. I wondered how long it would be until she came back from Australia with her father. Years, I supposed. Australia was on the other side of the world, across the ocean. A small part of my mind remembered an alternative pattern of events, and then lost it, as if I had woken from a comfortable sleep and looked around, pulled the bedclothes over me, and returned to my dream. Mrs. Hempstock got back into her ancient Land Rover, so bespattered with mud, I could see now in the light above the door, that there was almost no trace of the original paintwork visible, and she backed it up, drove down the drive towards the lane. My mother seemed unbothered that I had returned in fancy dress clothes at almost 11 at night. She said, "I have some bad news, dear." "What's that?" "Ursula's had to leave. Family matters. Pressing family matters. She's already left. I know how much you children liked her." I knew that I didn't like her, but I said nothing. There was now nobody sleeping in my bedroom at the top of the stairs. My mother asked if I would like my room back for a while. I said no, unsure of why I was saying no. I could not remember why I disliked Ursula Monckton so much. Indeed, I felt faintly guilty for disliking her so absolutely and so irrationally. But I had no desire to return to that bedroom, despite the little yellow hand basin just my size, and I remained in the shared bedroom until our family moved out of the house half a decade later. We children protesting, the adults, I think, just relieved that their financial difficulties were over. The house was demolished after we moved out. I would not go and see it standing empty, and refused to witness the demolition. There was too much of my life bound up in those bricks and tiles, those drain pipes and walls. Years later, my sister, now an adult herself, confided in me that she believed that our mother had fired Ursula Monckton, whom she remembered so fondly as the nice one in a sequence of grumpy childminders, because our father was having an affair with her. It was possible, I agreed. Our parents were both still alive then, and I could have asked them. But I didn't. My father did not mention the events of those nights. Not then, not later. If I took anything from him in my childhood, it was the resolve not to shout at people, and especially not to shout at children. I finally made friends with my father when I entered my 20s. We had so little in common when I was a boy, and I am certain I had been a disappointment to him. He did not ask for a child with a book, off in its own world. He wanted a son who did what he had done, swam and boxed and played rugby and drove cars at speed with abandon and joy. But that was not what he had wound up with. I did not ever go down the lane all the way to the end. I did not think of the white Minnie. When I thought of the opal miner, it was in the context of the 2 rough raw opal rocks that sat on our mantelpiece, and in my memory he always wore a checked shirt and jeans. His face and arms were tan, not the cherry red of monoxide poisoning, and he had no bow tie. Monster, the ginger tomcat the opal miner had left us, had wandered off to be fed by other families, and although we saw him from time to time, prowling the ditches and trees at the end of the lane, he would not ever come when we called. I was relieved by this, I think. He had never been our cat. We knew it, and so did he. A story only matters, I suspect, to the extent that the people in the story change. But I was 7 when all of these things happened, and I was the same person at the end of it that I was at the beginning, wasn't I? So was everyone else. People don't change. Some things change, though. A month or so after the events here, and 5 years before the ramshackle world I lived in was demolished and replaced by trim, squat, regular houses containing smart young people who worked in the city but lived in my town, who made money by moving money from place to place, but who did not build or dig or farm or weave, and 9 years before I would kiss smiling Callie Anders, I came home from school. The month was May, or perhaps early June. She was waiting by the back door, as if she knew precisely where I was, and who she was looking for. A young black cat, larger than a kitten now, with a white splodge over one ear, and with eyes of an intense, unusual greenish blue. She followed me into the house. I fed her with an unused can of Monster's cat food, which I spooned into Monster's dusty bowl. My parents, who had never noticed the Ginger Tom's disappearance, did not initially notice the arrival of the new kitten cat, and by the time my father commented on her existence, she had been living with us for several weeks, exploring the garden until I came home from school, then staying near me while I read or played. At night she would wait beneath the bed until the lights were turned out. Then she would accommodate herself on the pillow beside me, grooming my hair and purring so quietly as never to disturb my sister. I would fall asleep with my face pressed into her fur, while her deep electrical purr vibrated softly against my cheek. She had such unusual eyes. They made me think of the seaside, and so I called her Ocean, and could not have told you why. I sat on the dilapidated green bench beside the duck pond at the back of the red brick farmhouse, and I thought about my kitten. I only remembered that Ocean had grown into a cat, and that I had adored her for years. I wondered what had happened to her, and then I thought, it doesn't matter that I can't remember the details any longer. Death happened to her. Death happens to all of us. A door opened in the farmhouse, and I heard feet on the path. Soon the old woman sat beside me.
"I brung you a cup of tea,"
she said,
"and a cheese and tomato sandwich. You've been out here for quite a while. I thought you'd probably fallen in."
I sort of did, I told her, and thank you. It had become dusk without my noticing, while I had been sitting there. I took the tea and sipped it, and I looked at the woman more carefully this time. I compared her to my memories of 40 years ago. I said, "You aren't Letty's mother. You're her grandmother, aren't you? You're old Mrs. Hemstock."
"That's right,"
she said unperturbed.
"Eat your sandwich."
I took a bite of my sandwich. It was good, really good. Freshly baked bread, sharp, salty cheese, the kind of tomatoes that actually taste like something. I was awash in memory, and I wanted to know what it meant, what it all meant. I said, "Is it true?" and felt foolish. Of all my questions I could have asked, I asked that. Old Mrs. Hemstock shrugged.
"What you remember? Probably, more or less. Different people remember things differently. And you'll not get any two people remembering anything the same, whether they were there or not. You stand, two of you lot, next to each other, and they could be continents away for all it means anything."
There was another question I needed answered. I said, "Why did I come here?" She looked at me as if it were a trick question.
"The funeral," she said. "You wanted to get away from everyone and be on your own. So first of all, you drove back to the place you lived as a boy, and when that didn't give you what you missed, you came here. Like you always do."
Like I always do? I drank some more tea. It was still hot and strong enough. The perfect cup of builder's tea. You could stand a spoon straight up in it, as my father always said of a cup of tea of which he approved.
"Like you always do."
No, I said. I haven't been here since Letty went to Australia. Her going away party. And then I said, which never happened. You know what I mean.
You come back sometimes, she said. You were here once when you were 24, I remember. You had 2 young children, and you were so scared. You came here before you left these parts. You were, in your 30s then? I fed you a good meal in the kitchen, and you told me about your dreams and the art you were making.
I don't remember. She pushed the hair from her eyes.
It's easier that way.
I sipped my tea and finished the sandwich. The mug was white, and so was the plate. The endless summer evening was coming to an end. I asked her again, why did I come here? Letty wanted you to, said somebody. The person who said that was walking around the pond. A woman in a brown coat wearing Wellington boots. I looked at her in confusion. She looked younger than I was now. I remembered her as vast, as adult, but now I saw she was only in her late 30s. I remembered her as stout, but she was buxom and attractive in an apple-cheek sort of way. She was still Jenny Hempstock, Letty's mother, and she looked, I was certain, just as she had looked 40-something years ago. She sat down on the bench on the other side of me, so I was flanked by Hempstock women. She said, I think Letty just wants to know if it was worth it. If what was worth it?
You,
said the old woman tartly. Letty did a very big thing for you, said Jenny. I think she mostly wants to find out what happened next, and whether it was worth everything she did. She sacrificed herself for me. After a fashion, dear, said Jenny. The hunger birds tore out her heart. You screamed so piteously as you died. She couldn't abide that. She had to do something. I tried to remember this. I said, that isn't how I remember it. The old lady sniffed.
Didn't I just say you'll never get any 2 people to remember anything the same?
She asked. Can I talk to her? She's sleeping, said Letty's mother. She's healing. She's not talking yet.
Not until she's done where she is,
said Letty's grandmother, gesturing, but I could not tell if she was pointing to the duck pond or to the sky. When will that be?
When she's good and ready,
said the old woman, as her daughter said, soon. Well, I said, if she brought me here to look at me, let her look at me. And as I said it, I knew that it had already happened. How long had I been sitting on that bench? As I had been remembering her, she had been examining me. Oh, she did that already, didn't she? Yes, dear. And did I pass? The face of the old woman on my right was unreadable in the gathering dusk. On my left, the younger woman said, You don't pass or fail at being a person, dear. I put the empty cup and plate down on the ground. Jenny Hempstock said, I think you're doing better than you were the last time we saw you. You're growing a new heart, for a start. In my memory, she was a mountain, this woman, and I had sobbed and shivered on her bosom. Now she was smaller than I was, and I could not imagine her comforting me, not in that way. The moon was full in the sky above the pond. I could not for the life of me remember what phase the moon had been in the last time I noticed it. I could not actually remember the last time I had done more than glance at the moon. So what will happen now?
Same thing as happens every other time you come here, said the old woman. You go home.
I don't know where that is anymore, I told them. You always say that, said Ginny. In my memory, Letty Hempstock was still a full head taller than I was. She was 11, after all. I wondered what I would see, who I would see, if she stood before me now. The moon in the duck pond was full as well, and I found myself, unbidden, thinking of the holy fools in the old stories, the ones who went fishing in a lake for the moon with nets, convinced that the reflection in the water was nearer and easier to catch than the globe that hung in the sky. And of course it was. I got up and walked a few steps to the edge of the pond. Letty, I said, trying to ignore the two women behind me. Thank you for saving my life.
She should never have taken you with her in the first place when she went off to find the start of it all,
sniffed old Mrs. Hempstock.
Nothing to stop her sorting it out on her own. Didn't need to take you along for the company, silly thing. Well, that'll learn her for next time.
I turned and looked at old Mrs. Hempstock. Do you really remember when the moon was made? I asked.
I remember lots of things,
she said. Will I come back here again? I asked.
That's not for you to know,
said the old woman. Get along now, said Ginny Hempstock gently. There's people who are wondering where you've got to. And when she mentioned them, I realized, with an awkward horror, that my sister, her husband, her children, and my own, all the well-wishers and mourners and visitors, would be puzzling over what had become of me. Still, if there was a day that they would find my absent ways easy to forgive, it was today. It had been a long day, and a hard one. I was glad that it was over. I said, I hope that I haven't been a bother.
No, dear,
said the old woman.
No bother at all.
I heard a cat meow. A moment later it sauntered out of the shadows and into a patch of bright moonlight. It approached me, confidently, pushed its head against my shoe. I crouched beside it and scratched its forehead, stroked its back. It was a beautiful cat, black, or so I imagined, the moonlight having swallowed the color of things. It had a white spot over in one ear. I said, I used to have a cat like this. She was beautiful. I don't actually remember what happened to her. You brought her back to us, said Ginny Hempstock, and then she touched my shoulder with her hand, squeezing it for a heartbeat, and she walked away. I picked up my plate and my mug, and I carried them along the path with me as we made our way back to the house, the old woman and I. The moon does shine as bright as day, I said, like the song.
It's good to have a full moon,
she agreed. I said, it's funny. For a moment I thought there were two of you. Isn't that odd?
It's just me,
said the old woman.
It's only ever just me.
I know, I said. Of course it is. I was going to take the plate and mug into the kitchen, but she stopped me at the farmhouse door.
You ought to get back to your family now,
she said.
They'll be sending out a search party.
They'll forgive me, I said. I hoped that they would. My sister would be concerned, and there would be people I barely knew disappointed not to have told me how very, very sorry they were for my loss. You've been so kind. Let me sit and think here, by the pond. I'm very grateful.
Stuff and nonsense, she said. Nothing kind about it.
Next time Letty writes from Australia, I said, please tell her I said hello.
I will,
she said.
She'll be glad you thought of her.
I got into the car and started the engine. The old woman stood in the doorway, watching me, politely, until I had turned the car around and was on my way up the lane. I looked back at the farmhouse in my rearview mirror, and a trick of the light made it seem as if two moons hung in the sky above it, like a pair of eyes watching me from above. One moon perfectly full and round, the other, its twin, on the other side of the sky, a half moon. Curiously, I turned in my seat and looked back. A single half moon hung over the farmhouse, peaceful and pale and perfect. I wondered where the illusion of the second moon had come from, but I only wondered for a moment, and then I dismissed it from my thoughts. Perhaps it was an after-image, I decided, or a ghost, something that had stirred in my mind for a moment so powerfully that I believed it to be real. But now it was gone, and faded into the past like a memory forgotten, or a shadow into the dusk.